I don't think this is enough to make it like the main character of the film actually struggle with the ideals they're looking for, especially when their goal is basically total anarchy. Like he's looking for the complete deconstruction of any governmental organization within London by literally blowing it up. And so to come to that conclusion,
hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers, so that we can tell better stories ourselves. As always, I'm your host, Maverick, and today we have back with us our co-host, Andrew, to review V for Vendetta, the 2005 dystopian thriller with a screenplay by the Wachowskis and directed by James McTeague. And it's based on V for Vendetta by David Lloyd, or, well, illustrated by David Lloyd. We'll get into more on that later. But we want to get into those initial spicy details. So, Andrew, do you want to tell everyone what your initial impression and rating is for V for Vendetta?
the initial thoughts, it's a nice idea. I thought the execution was terrible in this film. I gave it a 3.7.
Dang. So pretty roughshod thoughts on this film for sure. I, for one, think that it is an interesting exercise. I think that there is a lot of things that you see in this film that you frankly don't see in a lot of the ways that other films are portrayed in regards to a storyline and how it runs. An interesting film. It leans very heavily on symbolism personified, and in many ways it tries to integrate us as bystanders into the film. So I think it has a lot of interesting ideas to play with. Whether it does those well, I think, is up for debate, and I'm willing to have a discussion on that. That being said, I do enjoy this film a lot. I gave it a 6.3. So there you go. There's a very big discrepancy starting off the year strong with a very big... Here we go. Let's see what happens. Before we get to that, as we always do, we got to give that summary, because what if they don't know what we're talking about? Shoot. Andrew, you want to give everyone a summary of what V for Vendetta is all about?
Sure. V for Vendetta follows arguably the only main character that you can truly follow is Evie. And her story going from a bystander and discovering this character of V, who has a vendetta against the current government in London. She starts out as being pretty passive. She ends up getting captured and going through some sort of transformation. Turns out the person that captured her was V, and he was trying to make it so she had no fear, and then she doesn't have fear, and now V still has his vendetta against the government and succeeds in the end in killing the government's leadership that he wanted to.
Pretty much. One of his less flattering summaries that he gave. Not surprising for Andrew, considering that 3 who knows what review. Let's get into...
It was better than the Joker.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to be as bad as Joker 2 at the very least.
True.
So we'll get into all of those thoughts today. Let's start off with that opening scene. We start off with this idea of introducing us to the character of Evie, introducing us to the character of V, starting off with the famous line from this film, remember the 5th of November, talking about the execution of Guy Fawkes back in the 1600s and his attempt to blow up Parliament. And then they fast forward to the current day with this idea of the more or less antagonism toward the government with this present day dystopian scenario of a totalitarian, overpowering Britain, and that is the setting for this world. And you get introduced to the character of Evie as she is accosted on the streets and is saved by V. What are your thoughts on the opening of this film?
I think it's going to be a complaint I have a lot of the time with this film, and it's like, right, I said at the beginning, it's nice in theory. I think they do a poor job executing it. I don't know if there's a good way to execute this, per se. But I think they've oftentimes prioritized symbolism over a lot of the main importance that you want in a film or a story that you're telling. And so they're just like, there's no real grounding at the beginning of this film. They're not really setting up too many expectations going into it, other than V is very poetic and likes long, big words that rhyme, and he's good at fighting with knives, and Evie is a damsel in distress. So, like, the monologue is fun. He like, kind of starts to almost rap by the end of it in British. I don't know if that's a thing. But, like, you don't really know what V wants. At this point, you don't know what his goals are. You don't know what Evie's goals are, other than, like, don't get sexually assaulted. And it's, I don't know. It's just, the opening was something that was like, oh, that was fun, but it's not enough to get me invested in the plot of this film, because I don't know why I'm here still by the end of it, if that makes sense. And then you also have the gunpowder plot at the beginning, which, to be honest, I'm still confused about, other than, my reaction is just, oh, more symbolism. Like, I don't know that it actually means something for the plot of the film, other than it's the symbolic nature it's meant to serve.
Sure. So I would, two things in regards to that, which is, I think, where we will have some significant disagreement for sure, is, first off, I don't think you need to know everyone's motivations clearly outlined by the beginning of this film. The introduction of the characters, you're not supposed to know everything about the characters. And so the idea that we don't have that at the beginning, I don't think is a fault in this example. What you do get at the beginning is you get, one, a damsel in distress, sure. Two, you get a mysterious character who goes to save her. And then three, you get this demonstration that he's clearly against the government. And that is demonstrated by the destruction of the Old Bailey, which is the courthouse in this scenario against the totalitarian government of Britain. And so in that scenario, sure, you don't know who V is, what exactly he's trying to achieve, other than this goal that he is against the current society that they live in. And at the same time, there are people that he doesn't want to get punished by that government. I personally think that's enough to get us invested in the plot. I think it's interesting because you are curious, who is this character? What does he want? Why is he here? What's going on? And at the same time, while not all those questions are answered, it draws us into a further questioning and trying to understand what's going on as you get at least a general thrust and direction for the film going forward.
I see where you're going with this idea of, like, we don't need to know their goals. I think you still need some sort of reason to latch on to characters, right? And I don't think that Evie just being a damsel in distress is enough for me to go, outside of, like, oh, I'm recording a podcast on this, or I enjoy watching films and seeing, like, how they explore different ideas. And purely in terms of the entertainment value or the engagement I might get out of it, I don't feel like Evie is engaging as just a damsel in distress in this initial opening scene. V is interesting in that he's mysterious, so, like, I give it some points, but, like, other than his monologue and the theatrics he presents, I don't enjoy the opener all that much.
Sure, and to be clear, I think some of that comes more from an idea that you don't necessarily like Evie as a main character than necessarily that has a ton to do with how much they engage you as the opening scene. I don't know that, like, the opening scene you're going to get, even if she was I think we're going to come to more conclusions on Evie as a character, and I think that we'll come to some similar opinions on, like, Evie being fully developed. I don't know that that's necessarily the case in this film. And I think that, like, that is not necessarily a fault of the opener. That's more of a fault of that character-specific development. But the opener itself, I think, has that action, does have a lot going for it. And also, to be clear, it's not a big part of the rating anymore. If you looked at our last explanation of how we're doing the 9 points in a collaborative effort to try to make it more holistic in how it's reviewing, this specific aspect of the 9 points rating was significantly nerfed. It lost a lot in regards to how much value it contributes. So while I think it's important to notice how much we are engaged in a film from the start, it's not going to make or break a film. And in fact, very little is going to be taken away by how significantly you're like, oh, wow, this was amazing, or like, that's whatever. So with all that being said, I think it's important to really get into the meat of the issue and say, is the main character and the compelling? And, who is the main character, as we always ask?
I mean, I think you kind of have to go with Evie, to be honest. Given that V has, he's purely symbolic throughout almost the entirety of the film.
Okay. So what are your thoughts on Evie?
Her whole, transformation in the prison cell felt almost like a fever dream in my mind. And then everything leading up to that, she's just kind of this damsel in distress. Her entire goal is just survive. She doesn't have any sort of emotional stakes in this fight. And then she just goes, oh yeah, my parents died. I do want to do something about this. Was just, I don't know. I don't buy it as a character. It feels almost contrived. And that's how I feel about a lot of these characters, is they do things that feel convenient for the plot. And it's she didn't care about this until it was convenient for her to care about it and want to help out V. But if she's been sitting on this and brewing on this idea of her brother and her parents were taken away by this government, you'd think this was kind of stirring a lot more, but she ends up being really passive throughout this film. Up until the very end, and then she just kind of becomes this emotionless creature, which I also don't buy, because it's she read a story about someone and that made her lose her fears, I guess. I don't know. It feels like the changes are, one, through some form of coercion or manipulation that occurs, and then secondly, the growth just feels convenient for the plot rather than actually a natural outflowing of her character.
Yeah, so let's actually get into, well, we rarely do this, but for the sake of this film specifically, I think this film is trying to do something very different from a lot of films. And so I've wanted to review it for a while, specifically because I think because of what it tries to do, and see if those things work or don't. And obviously we come to different conclusions there, so I think it's worthy of discussion. There's three characters that I think specifically are trying to do the same thing in different ways, and that's Evie, that is the friend who, now I need to remember his name. It is Gordon Deitrich, who's the show host, and then there is also the character of the Chief Inspector Finch. And all of these characters are supposed to go through the same arc from different directions, of this idea that you go from being basically not against the government to learning to stand up against a tyrannical government, right? And they come at it from different angles. Evie is supposed to take more of that passive, everyday bystander type stance, where she is supposed to be just more or less the everyday Joe. And I think that's where I would generally agree with you, where it's they wanted this bystander to be representative of the everyday person, but then they also needed her to have motivations that caused her to be engaged in the plot we were watching. So she was definitely, in a strong sense, supposed to be symbolic in what she represented. And because of that, because they were trying to have both of these things happen, they did in some ways roughshod situations for her to make sense. For example, the situation with her parents. And was she brooding over this? Well, then why didn't she take any action previously? Why was she just helping the tyrannical government by helping them run the British television network, which was the propaganda arm for the government, right? What is going on in her life that she's actually trying to do something about that, right? And in this case, it doesn't necessarily work out super in a way that if you reflect on it logically, it doesn't necessarily become something that you buy a ton. So yeah, I definitely see that where that character comes from, and I would agree with that she becomes almost they're so caught up in the symbolism of her that her character as a whole is lacking in regards to the cohesiveness. That being said, I still think that the idea that they're going for, especially in the torture scene, where it turns out that she gets captured and she's getting tortured by the British government, only to find out she wasn't getting tortured by the British government. She was being tortured by V the entire time, is in some ways a very interesting idea, and I think it still holds emotion in the moment that I don't know that necessarily translates well into how she goes forward into the rest of the film. So I think that there's like interesting things they play with her. They just don't mesh well together, which is a big problem for her as a character. To touch on the other two briefly, just to bring it full circle, I think in regards to Gordon Deitrich, he's supposed to be somewhat subversive. You see him doing some subversive actions, and what he sees in this moment is the need to rise up and take visible action rather than mild action against the government. And that's another aspect of attacking the government. And then the third one is more or less having the veil torn away from someone within the government as they realize what they're doing is wrong and evil and decides to stand against that rather than continue to support it. So those are like the three different areas: the passive person standing by, the person who's quietly being like railing against the government, and then the person who is supporting the government and then changes their mind. Obviously, they're trying to have very personified characters within this, and I think that some of these characters don't do as well. We'll get to the other two in just a minute, but I wanted to hear what your thoughts are responding to that, especially around Evie.
Yeah, I mean, we'll save that for later, but I'm not a huge fan of Evie's character. I already said that. I don't know that I have too much to add in terms of that. Like, I understand what thematically each of these characters is meant to represent, and I do think that the officer and the TV host add more to that, or have more depth, I should say, than Evie, which is ironic considering they're in it less, I think. But Evie's character,
for sure, Gordon is. Yeah, he's definitely in it less. The officer has a solid amount of screen time, but even then is less than Evie. So yeah,
and
it's not like he's shirked per se, I would say, compared to the other ones. Anyways, keep going.
Yeah, I just feel like their motivations as characters and what drives them through the plot is a lot more believable than what Evie is driving Evie as a character, because it goes from I need to survive and I just want to avoid getting sexually assaulted to my parents were taken and my brother was taken and I wish to exact vengeance on the government. Why? Because I met a man with long hair and a mask who convicted me. I don't know. Like, I just don't buy it. I don't think her character's believable. I don't enjoy her arc either. Like, her whole thing when she's like reading that letter and it's like somehow that's like the key for her. I don't see how that ends up being the thing in her life that she goes, yes, the government is evil for doing this. She kind of throughout the movie before this gives the indication that she already knows the government does things like this. And so
sure. I think just to push back on that just a second, I think the idea they're going for in that scenario is that it's one thing to know something is happening and another to, in some ways, live it out for yourself and then to come to those conclusions alongside someone else's struggle. I think that's what they were going for with that. And I think in some degrees it's not completely devoid of value in how they present it either.
I mean, again, I think it's thematically heavy, so I think that there is some level of transformation that does exist. I just don't think that her character is a good execution of how that transformation should exist.
Sure. Well, what are your thoughts on Deitrich, the comedy show host who ends up railing against the government in his own way by creating a show that is not allowed, that makes fun of the prime minister who is in charge of the tyrannical government and then ends up getting captured by that said government?
His character's more ambiguous than I think he needs to be. I think he should have been a little clearer as a character, like what was going on there, before the whole like reveal. Because it's like you get this idea, and we talked about this when we go over subverting expectations and like plot twists. And you have like this twist that he's gay, which, by the way, the reveal that he's gay is just basically gay porn on his wall. He just kind of is there, and they're like, oh, plot twist, he's gay, but you're like, I didn't know who he was before this, so it's not really a twist for me.
Sure.
I kind of figured out at that point that he was the one she was going to visit. There was that line earlier on where he's like, I've never had someone stand me up. I just was not sure if that was supposed to be a romantic get together or some sort of secret get together or what. And in my mind, it's kind of like, all right, wait, Evie's trying to avoid the government, and yet she's going to sneak out past curfew just to go see some old guy who's clearly easily a decade older than her. Like, what is going on here? I feel like we're missing so much context right now. I think after that point, he gets introduced, and he's only there for like, what, the next 10 minutes, if that.
Yeah.
I think that portion of it's fine, right? He's just supposed to be, he's supposed to represent someone in the media who gets fed up with just, like, regurgitating a tyrannical government's propaganda, and so he puts something else in his stead, and he clearly underestimates how tyrannical that government is. Man, those are my thoughts on him. I think that once you get to the point where you understand who he is, and you get through all of the kind of the schmuck of like introducing him, he's fine.
Yeah, I mean, like I think that for the amount of time that he has on screen and what they develop, it's not like he's a bad character. He's just developing, like you said, the media aspect of it, and how would you revolt from a media perspective to say this is wrong, we shouldn't do this. And his demonstration of that was a little more cohesive than hers, but it's also much more contained within a short period within the film, and so you can't expect a lot more to be coming from his character anyways. Yeah, and I think for his development, it was fine. I honestly think that the Inspector is the more interesting character of the three. What are your thoughts on Chief Inspector Eric Finch?
Probably the most interesting character in the film, in my opinion. I think V is interesting. The problem with V is he is so completely wrapped up in the themes and the messages of the film, and he's so symbolic that he's like, he is more symbol than person in this film. And so it's like, I don't even really consider him a character so much as an idea. And they literally throw that in your face at the end where she's like, he was my father, my mother, my brother, my friend, me, you. And it's like, okay, thank you for spelling that out for me. I didn't know that yet. I do enjoy the Inspector, though, because you get this very real struggle where he is trying to operate within the bounds of the law and do what's right, but then also realizing that all of the people that are within power are the people that are doing these corrupt things. And he's kind of going back and forth, too, because he doesn't trust V. V's a terrorist. But he's also realizing that V has legitimate reasons for being upset with the government. So you kind of get that dynamic as he goes throughout the film, wavering back and forth, almost like some sort of speedometer or dial, and then eventually coming to the point where he's like, yeah, the government is corrupt.
Yeah. And I think that they play that out really well, and you see it come to that conclusion near the end of the film, where you had early on, right, V, soon after blowing up the Old Bailey, the next day, actually, he has an announcement go on by basically threatening to blow up the British television network, and says, you have to play this film that I made, or else I'm going to blow you all up. And so they do, and it's a video that says, hey, come out at the same time next year and march on the Capitol if you think that the government's corrupt, more or less. And then from there, it's a countdown to see within the next year, what will all of society do? And during that time, that is when the chief inspector is having to try to figure out who V is, what he's doing, why this all occurred, and you start to unravel these mysteries of these illegal activities that the government was doing, terrible things to people, experimenting on people, trying to develop weapons out of people, and all of these other things to build a society that they want and to cause people to live in fear and then profit off of it, create a government off of it, etc., etc. And he realizes that this was all built off of lies and illicit activity. And this is what causes him at the end to, in the moment of crisis, he tells the people that he's in charge of, like, don't fight the people, stand down, let them keep walking. And he then goes off to and allows the destruction of the government to continue as the film progresses. So that is his real turning point, and you see this is not something that he comes to lightly, but he really struggles with as he realizes that there are real consequences to the actions that he takes as a significant member of the government. And this is not something that should just be taken offhand, or he should just follow resolutely without thinking about what he's doing. So yeah, I definitely think that they play that out very well. And especially because he is a high profile individual in the government, it's not a small thing that him turning on the government becomes by the end of the film. So yeah, I would definitely say that of the characters in the film, he does quite well, and I think he's probably one of my favorite characters in the film for sure. With all that being said, I think that I subverted the conversation to these side characters because I thought it was important. What are your thoughts on V?
I don't like him. I think there are better ways for a protagonist to embody an idea. And I think with V, he embodies an idea that is never tested in this film. And what I mean by that is he's never forced to question the ideas that he has. He is only ever validated and not tested by other characters around him, and he never changes. And that doesn't mean that he doesn't have to necessarily change the ideas that he adheres to. And we talked about this, right, when we go over the 9 points. I really like Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan never changes the ideals that he holds to, even though they are constantly put under fire. V never changes how he believes, but that's because he's never tested and only validated as the film progresses. To the point that I, as the viewer, never question whether or not V will succeed, or whether this movie is portraying V as being in the right here. He is constantly in the right, regardless of the things that he does, which probably should be looked at as, they just should be looked at as questionable. And yet it isn't portrayed that way. It's portrayed as he did what was necessary to fight off this tyrannical government. And then that gets into the villain of this film, which I think is probably one of the most blaring problems with it. But the fact that the villain is unable to put pressure on his ideals and he just continues to be validated throughout the film, and there's no counter argument or good counter argument to his ideals, I think makes him into a failed protagonist narratively.
Sure. So first off, I think that I would agree that I think he actually is the protagonist. I don't think Evie is the protagonist of this film. I think that this is one of those stories where, and this is more of a side, but this is one of those examples where a story is told from a certain perspective, but that person is not actually supposed to be front and center to the story. I think the front and center person is supposed to be V. And so he, in many ways, is supposed to embody the protagonist, the person who's pushing forward and making solutions to occur. I also do think that he is one of the few characters that I've seen that I think does not change in the film, and I think that that's intentional. He has these ideals, and you talked about Obi-Wan. I think that, yes, he has these ideals and stays stalwart in them, but they're not necessarily ideals that we generally think of as quote-unquote ideal, right? And that's because he more or less is embodying, frankly, he's embodying hate. And I think that that is something that we should question. Is that something you should be holding up as a virtue? And he even talks about how basically you have to lean into that as he has these discussions with Evie, especially post the torture scene where he goes you have to embrace that. You have to lean into it. And she's like, well, I hate you. And he's like, yes, that's exactly right. Do it. His little Emperor Palpatine. Yes, good.
Yeah.
That's the kind of embodiment that you're getting from him in that moment. And in the same way, you see that I think that that's a perfect example where he is actually questioning and doubting himself in the middle of that, because he is saying that he hates himself for what he has come to the conclusions to. And even after she leaves, you see that he is full of, in some ways, regret and anger about that, because he comes to realize that this girl that he has been torturing is someone that he actually has come to care for, and is causing him in some ways to doubt the path that he's going down. And so when he's coming to these conclusions, he at the end of the day decides to continue down this path of destroying the government, because he believes that is the ultimate end he needs to achieve, and it is the ultimate quote-unquote good for society.
I think the only place you can make the argument that he actually is struggling is that one scene where he takes the mask and, like, smashes it into the mirror. I don't think this is enough to make it, like, the main character of the film actually struggle with the ideals they're looking for, especially when their goal is basically total anarchy. Like, he's looking for the complete deconstruction of any governmental organization within London by literally blowing it up. And so to come to that conclusion, him struggling, like, that's the other thing that I think makes it, this film ends up making it very difficult for itself, is by making him the protagonist, which I agree he is the protagonist. I think Evie is why I say she is the best argument for a protagonist, in the sense that, like, she'd be the best argument for a good protagonist, even though I think she's not. Because V is so wrapped up in ideas and symbolism, and because that symbolism isn't challenged throughout the film, I think it makes for an even worse protagonist. But he's going to these extremes, right? And you have great characters who go to extremes. Paul Atreides, Eren Yeager, Darth Vader, right? They have very clear reasons as to why they're going to this extreme, and they very clearly struggle with these ideas. Now, you could also make the argument, right? They have more time to develop these characters. I think you could probably watch Revenge of the Sith and get a good grasp of why Anakin falls to the dark side. Regardless of whether or not you think 3 is a good movie, they give him motivation, right? He's being used constantly by the council. He references killing the Sand People and being a slave and his mother dying, and all of the times that he feels like he is not given a voice to the emotions and the things that are building up inside of him. And then at the end, there's the one person, or one of the 2 people other than Obi-Wan, that he feels like in his life actually cares about him, is feeding him this lie, and he falls for that. You get Eren Yeager, who feels like it's the only way, based on the things... all right, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Attack on Titan. Actually, no, we're not going to say that, because most people haven't. But you should go watch it. It's good. Paul Atreides, same thing, right? He's pushed to extremism. V, we get the idea that he was tortured, which is like, okay, so he's already gotten to the point where extremism is where he needs to go. And yet, how long was Evie in the cell? It was like months, right? Or was it weeks?
I believe so. They don't give you an exact timeline.
Yeah,
all you know is that between the time when he blows up the Old Bailey and at the end where they're attacking...
it's been a year.
I believe. Yeah, it's been a year. So at some point within that, she arrives and is tortured and then also leaves. And it indicates that it is some period of time that she's there.
Yeah. So he basically goes through this whole thing. And they do in my mind, they commit the cardinal sin of storytelling, which is to tell and not show, when he literally tells her, it was so difficult for me to do this every single day and not tell you. And I understand why they did it, because they're telling the story from her perspective, so they can't show that very well. I would have preferred them not to have him say that, and just after she leaves, to just show the scene with him smashing his mask into the mirror. That I actually thought was a pretty good scene, because you're taking this mask that is his identity, everything that he's working towards, the symbolism, the messages, the ideas, and he is smashing it into a mirror, which is this almost declaration of, I can't believe I just did that. Like, this thing that I'm fighting for is terrible. That I think is a much more powerful statement than him looking Evie in the eyes and going, I had such a hard time doing this. It was so difficult. But then also turning around and saying, yes, hate me. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
The whole thing felt full of contradictions.
I think this is one of the few times where I'd argue it's not necessarily inorganic for his character to say that, simply because you see that he has care for her as a character, and what he's trying to do is a desperate effort to reclaim that after what he's just done. And it doesn't really work. She at the end of the day, she still walks away. Now, ultimately, she comes back, and I think there's a flaw more with her character and, like, the cohesiveness of her character, but, like, for his character specifically, I don't think that it was inorganic for him to go, like, yes, I did all these bad things, but I was doing it, and I really wish I didn't, because I felt like it was the right thing to do because of this ideal, once again, this ideal that he was holding up as necessary as the ultimate good or the ultimate goal for him in life. But anyways, I mean, we could go back and forth on the nuance of that. I don't know that we're necessarily going to come to a full agreement on that. I think the bigger thing that beyond how he develops as a character that I think was interesting and how his character is portrayed is that his character is one that lives in the shadows, not just as like a Dark Knight Batman-esque character, but more so in the sense that we, even as audiences, don't really know who he is. And so the question isn't necessarily like, oh, what's going to happen to him? The question more becomes, what is he going to do next, right? And I think that is more what drives the plot and makes the plot intriguing going forward. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I really don't think that I end up questioning what he's going to do next. He's going to blow stuff up. That's what he wants to do. He starts out the film doing it, he finishes the film doing it, and all the way in between he's killing people. So his entire path is just paved with destruction. The question is not what is he going to do next, it's what is he going to destroy next. Is it going to be a person, a building, a monument? So, and because I don't end up feeling like he is ever threatened, it almost becomes cartoonish by the end when he gets shot full of bullets and he goes, you can't kill an idea. And you're just like, oh my gosh, okay. Literal plot armor there. What are we doing here? Like, okay, buddy. But throughout the whole...
I mean, he had actual body armor, so it wasn't like completely just like, oh, it was riddled full of holes, but sure.
Well, he literally lays it out so explicitly for the audience, which is another problem with the film in my opinion.
I'm not going to deny that the thematic thing is just spelled out there. I'm just to be clear to the audience, it's not like as cut and dry as you were making it sound.
Well, I feel like with that many bullets, you could have gotten shot in the head or the arm or the hand or somewhere, but the fact that every single one of those bullets and every bullet and all of their magazines just went to his chest is like, okay. That aside, though, I never felt like V was going to fail in this film. He is set up as this indomitable force against the government. I feel like I need to bring the villain in right now to get where I'm trying to go here.
Sure.
It is one thing if you are trying to make the protagonist almost like an antagonist in and of themselves in a film, right? You get this with Attack on Titan is a great example, right? You have the antagonist, the actual antagonist, the thing that everyone's fighting against, and then you have the protagonist also being a type of antagonist because the things they're doing to fight against this evil, to counter it, are just as heinous, if not worse. And so when you do that, though, you have to make the audience in some ways feel for the villain. You not necessarily side with them, but empathize with where they're coming from. Understanding, like, okay, these are two opposing groups or people that want certain goals, and they have reasons for wanting those goals that are very believable, and I can empathize with them, but I'm obviously going to side with one person out of these two. the villain in this film is so cartoonishly evil that I as the audience, I'm like, okay, obviously they're bad, therefore I'm going to side with V. But because I'm siding with V, and I have no reason to believe he will fail, it makes his character feel so much less in terms of substance, because what he's pushing up against, the thing he's resisting, is just like so cartoonishly bad. Like they're literally just a tyrannical regime for the sake of being a tyrannical regime. And so it's not necessarily the fault of the protagonist per se that they're so bad, but because they're so bad, I think he ends up lacking more so in that regard. Especially when like I said before, I think the ideas he's standing for don't really get pushed back on.
Sure. Well, and I think that the questions that you're pushing, that he's pushing back on, comes to a head in two different ways. One, you don't know exactly what he's standing for until he plays the tape at the British television network, and there he's basically saying, if you agree that the government is bad, come to the capital on this same day next year, more or less, right? And I think that really drives home like what is we're going for, because I think we could all agree, yeah, what you're going to see next coming from V is he's trying to dismantle this government, and so he's going to do nefarious actions to cause that to occur. The question isn't necessarily whether he will continue to blow things up. The question is his ultimate goal of waking up society and getting everyone to push back against this government, will that happen? Because without that happening, ultimately he will become a martyr and he will die at some point in this continued fight against the government, and nothing will change if the society doesn't rise up with him. And so I think the question is like, will that ultimately be achieved by the end of the film? And that's where you get some of the doubt coming from other characters. You know, Evie being captured and then tortured. You seeing Deitrich character end up getting captured and then getting killed. Other things like that are the embodiment of his goal being subverted in other ways. And so I think that there is still some doubt being brought into the forefront in that regard, and it's not inherently clear that happens. I think that it's interesting just because this is not the first time I've come across the idea of a protagonist character that is still the curiosity of what's going to happen next driving it primarily forward. And the other example I think of when this comes to mind is Isaac Asimov's series Foundations. Now, to be very clear, I'm not talking about the TV show. I have not watched the recent TV show. I got like 6 episodes in, and it was so different from the books that I abhorred it and refused to watch it. So if you like it, that's nothing against the show. That is just so different from the books, I couldn't stand it. The books are very much in this vein of this grand overarching scheme going on, but there's mini stories within it, and the mini stories encompass small characters and then move on to a completely different story oftentimes, many times, thousands of years later, continuing this grand overarching arc and pushing it forward. And so interesting things are happening, and they're continuing to happen in the path that had been laid out from the beginning. But the question still remains, is this goal that he set at the beginning, is it able to be achieved across thousands of years in a way that he can no longer realistically have any reins over and control the end outcome? And so I think those questions are interesting ways to develop a story in a way that you don't normally see. And I think this is another somewhat similar example of that.
I don't know. I just the fact that he himself has no real, like, his entire character, again, wrapped up in symbolism. You don't get to see his perspective on everything that's happening. And one of the ways you as a viewer or a reader can see the struggle, as like, even if he's struggling with these ideals, is to see him struggle with them. But because you're seeing everyone else's perspective, you don't actually see him. This is relating to the idea of like his goals being uncertain. You don't feel like they're uncertain because he's constantly succeeding. And because the only thing you see from him is his success, I don't feel like him succeeding in the end is ever uncertain throughout the entirety of this film.
Sure. I mean, and once again, I think that comes to a difference on what we see the goal is, right? I think that you see the goal as him like being the singular individual who dismantles the government. And I see it as like him understanding that the body of society as a whole must be involved in this fight. And those are two very different goals to be trying to achieve. And in the one case, yeah, for sure. If that's all you're going for, is he going to continue to fight against the tyrannical government? Yes, he will. There is no doubt about that, and we'll continue to see people die and things blow up. But if the question is will society agree with this? Well, underneath a tyrannical dictatorship, which, sure, is stock, I will grant, but they do continue to kill people. They do continue to suppress the media. They do continue to take matters into their own hands in a way that will suppress society from disagreeing with them. That does continue to occur, and occur effectively in a way that I would argue you don't really know if society will side with him at the end until the end.
I mean,
other than Evie, I think Evie you would agree probably by the end, but that's more so of how her character is portrayed.
I mean, even then, though, every time they show society as a whole, they're rooting for V. Like, there's no semblance of society not rooting for V when they're watching the television, when he shows like that little girl and it continues to go back to her to spray painting and then getting shot and dressing up as V and getting shot because of it. Like, I never see an instance in that film, and maybe I just missed it, but I didn't once see an instance where, other than the one police officer, the sergeant, everyone's pretty much on board with V's plan from the get-go. Like, they're like, oh, this is great. We love it. And so...
But that's the whole point. The whole point is not that people... Like, everyone agrees that a tyrannical dictatorship is bad. The question is not, is there agreement there? The question is, will people actually do something about it? And that's where the little girl, for example, is a perfect example of that, because society as a whole really isn't doing a ton. And then when society sees a little girl taking action and then gets shot, that's when society says, no, that's not cool. And they do start taking action. And that's like literally almost at the end of the film.
Okay, but where in the film do I, like, because you're the one making this argument, but where in the film do I, as the viewer, get the idea or the semblance that they would not act? Because they were just told by V at the beginning of the film, on November 5th, if you're going to act, come here. So he's not calling them to act up until that point. So where am I, as the audience, supposed to be given the impression that they wouldn't show up on November 5th?
And I think that's where Evie is supposed to be the representation, right? Which is why they have this dichotomy of her being both the representation of society and then also trying to give her this nuance that doesn't really work in regards to her character specifically. But in regards to like the societal argument, I think that still applies, because what you see is she is this character who is constantly saying, I don't want to be involved in this, for like most of the film. And then she sits there and she goes, oh, yeah, I'll help you, V. And then she goes, no, I don't actually want to help you. And she tries to argue with the priest who she's around and says, oh, there's a terrorist who's trying to kill you and just let me be free. And she realizes that's not going to work, right? And she continues to try to hide. And like her constant method is, even though she disagrees with the government and thinks it's wrong, she's trying to run away from it. And that's not working. The argument is that as a whole, society, he's trying to make the argument that society as a whole needs to stand up. And in the representation of Evie, she's not standing up. She's trying to hide. She's trying to run away. And so that is the question, is like, will characters like her ultimately stand up?
Okay. I mean, I guess I just don't buy that she's a very effective portrayal of society, especially when you have, like, intermingled throughout the film, like, shots of just families in general, and none of them seem like they're kind of not wanting any to do with V at all. Like, I guess, like, in my mind, if there was a shot of, say, a group of people and they saw something happen and did nothing, that would be a pretty good indicator of, like, okay, now I don't know if they'll show up on November 5th when it comes up. But we aren't really given that. And then the second that something does happen, which is the little girl getting shot, like, they all unanimously attack that officer. And maybe that just goes to the fact that I think Evie's character is really, really bad in this film. And that's not to say that Natalie Portman's acting's bad. I just think that the character's written really, really poorly. So I don't know if we're gonna get anywhere going into
no. I mean, ultimately, I would say that like you're meshing both of them together in a way that you're not able to separate them. Which, sure, I get why you come to the conclusion. I think she is a good representation of society. I think she's a bad character. And so I think and once again, that goes to the symbolism aspect, right? I think the symbolism is very heavy. And so when you go to her symbolically representing society, I do think she does that very well. But when it comes to actual character development, it's just not there for her. And so you're kind of sitting there going, well, okay, you're kind of contradicting yourself from earlier, and that it isn't a cohesive flow of your character from point A to point B, which I actually agreed with that from the beginning. So
yeah. And to be clear, like, if they got rid of the scenes showing people watching the television and their reactions to V in that one television like clip, I think the case for her being a representation of society as a whole would be a much stronger case. I just think that her being on one side and then the rest of society not showing that same emotion makes it very difficult for me when I'm like viewing this to go, oh yes, she has to be the representation for all of society when the rest of society is not following that same pattern.
Well, sure, I would make the argument that single example of the television still flows, just because, like, even watching that, they can agree that is still just the railing against the machine. The people of society are watching the television saying, yes, the government is bad, and that's it. Like, they're sitting in their houses not doing anything about it. And the whole point of the film is, like, if you think a government is doing something wrong, you need to stand up and say something and do something. And, like, laughing at the television is not doing anything.
Sure. And I mean, I think I would, at the end of the day, I would just say they were never asked to do anything and they were told to show up on November 5th. I mean, if he had asked them to show up, like, in a few weeks and nobody showed up, I think that would make his goals much more uncertain. And then, like, maybe throughout the film as it progresses, society gets to a breaking point, and then they do, that I think would make the message a lot more compelling than him going, all right, guys, in 1 year from now, I'm going to have an epic plan. Make sure you save the date. And then nobody does anything, but it's like, okay, they weren't expected to. Like, he's organizing this massive event, and then when the event does occur, this girl happens to get shot, and they all show up anyway. So it's like, would they have shown up absent the girl getting shot? I don't know.
Sure. And to be clear, I'm not going to say it's perfect. I think that, like, I gave it a low 6. Like, I enjoyed it a lot. I would watch it again, but it doesn't mean that I don't think it doesn't have some of those nuanced flaws there. I would agree generally they could have done that a little bit better than how they portrayed it. But I still don't think that it's completely devoid of value there. But
sure, we
should definitely move on. And in regards to, like, the villains, for sure, they are very stock, if I didn't mention that before. We don't need to dwell on that too much, other than it's supposed to be the big bad guy. And that's what you got. What are your thoughts on now that we've discussed all of that, like the themes that they did present in this film? Did you think they were interesting ideas? Were they developed in a way that you thought was at least cohesive and sending a clear message? What were your thoughts?
I think the message it's the same critique I have of, like, Christian media and even Disney media, which is that despite the fact that I like the message they're trying to convey in concept or in theory, I like the idea, the message of resisting tyrannical governments, right? I think, one, the message becomes overt and preachy. The film ends up answering its own questions, and because it does so, it doesn't leave space for the audience to interpret things. I think good examples of the way this does play out are films like Dark Knight, right? These questions of justice. How do we attain it? What is the bright line for just actions? It ends up telling you what to think, like, very loudly as the film progresses. I think it also just does a disservice to the idea of tyranny, right? Like, this is a tyrannical government. How did they amass power? What are they opposing? And I think it's so stupid that the entirety of this regime gets whittled down to, we don't like gay people. Like, that is what they're portrayed as. We aren't really given any other, like, group of people or idea that they oppose other than, like, the basic, oh, don't resist us, we are going to censor things. Like, that's pretty stock. Like, that's necessary for a tyrannical regime. But different regimes or have laws and mandates against different things. This regime in this film is pretty much just made out to be a homophobic regime, and that is their entire persona. It's like, oh, look, there's 2 gay men, and they didn't like them. Oh, look, this woman who was in a cell, she was gay, and they didn't like her. Oh, look, this one TV broadcaster is gay, and they don't like him. I guess they just don't like gays, and that's the message is, you can tell a government is tyrannical if they don't like gays. Therefore, they're bad. Like, I thought it was really stock. I think it's really bad also because they whittle it down to this singular idea that just becomes so unbelievable as an audience member watching this film. It's like, I don't think it's a problem to have the tyrannical government oppose homosexuality and, like, penalize it. Like, okay, that for a far-right regime, that's a pretty understandable thing for the far-right regime to oppose. But for that to be the only thing that they're opposing, and every single instance you have of someone being penalized is a person who's gay, is like, all right, what am I supposed to take away from this? I found it very, very basic. So
yeah, and to be clear, and I would generally agree with you. They do provide other examples, quote unquote, such as religion, and they bring up the Quran in there as an example. But at the end of the day, and they say that the main guy, the broadcaster, ends up getting killed because he had a Quran hidden in his secret room. But at the end of the day, every example you get is pretty much due to the homosexuality issue. So even if they bring up those other examples, they aren't really supported in the film. So yeah, anyways, but keep going.
So I think that the villains, the messages and themes that they're portraying, I think fall flat because they're pushing so hard for this idea of, like, look, they're opposing homosexuality, and then just in general the message ends up being, even for the good guys, ends up being so overt and preachy that we as the audience are essentially told what to believe by the end. Even to the extent of, like, I think the 2 best examples of this are, one, when he literally tells that one guy towards the end of the film, he's like, you can't kill an idea, basically. And it's like, look, I'm the idea. You can't kill me. Aha. Cool pun. And then secondarily, towards the end, when Evie is talking to the police sergeant, and she's just like, he was my father, he was my mother, me, you. To be honest, when she first said he was my father, I was like, wait, I feel like I might have missed something. What do you mean? And then she kept going. I was like, oh, we're just preaching. Okay. All right. Nice. Preach, sister. So it's unfortunate because I think, like, I had no idea what to expect going into this film. At the outset, you very quickly realize they're going for these themes of tyranny and corruption, which are, like, I think they're cool themes for almost any film. I think they're very, very relatable themes, right? They're almost as old as man itself, this idea of, like, enslaving other men and power corrupting and absolute power corrupting absolutely, right? You have David in the Bible telling God to not give him too much lest he become prideful, and give him just enough to, like, sustain himself. So the ideas are nice, just like I think the ideas in, say, the Kendrick brothers films are nice. I just think that the ideas end up being shoved down your throat, right? And I think, like, the critiques of, say, like, Disney films where they're shoving more liberal ideas down your throat, I don't dislike the film because of the ideas. I dislike the film because those ideas are being shoved down my throat. I'm being force-fed.
Yeah. And I think that, like, some of those ideas that are surrounding it are a little more nuanced, which is why I didn't, like, give it terrible points in regards to this one. I think the ideas of, for example, hate being a motivating and driving factor isn't as explicitly played out, but plays a significant role into the development of, for example, V's character and Evie's character, if you want to try to buy that, or the ideas of, like, society as a whole rising up isn't as explicitly laid out. But then the idea of just like, this is an idea and is personified and we should just hate tyranny is very clearly being like, yes, this is what I am and you cannot kill me because of that. Sure, those were not necessarily, we didn't need that climactic like final line that you sit there and you write in the writer's room and think, oh, this is going to be so epic. And then it plays out in the screen and everyone goes, okay, well, I mean, sure. I mean, I was already getting that. You didn't have to say it. So, yeah, I would agree that the line at the end probably was a little too much. But yeah, I mean, I think that the themes are there, and they're, if anything, the themes are the biggest part of this film. So it's a menagerie of them in a, in your face type of way. So that being said, I didn't hate the film as much as Andrew did. So there you go. What are your thoughts on the lasting impact of this film?
Let's see. Audience members. I feel like we should have a poll for this on YouTube. Have you ever heard of the movie V for Vendetta? Because I certainly hadn't until this. So, I don't know. Okay, that's not true. I had heard of it previously, and that's because I read a massive encyclopedia on Star Wars, and they had a section on Natalie Portman, and it talked about it. But, that aside, I didn't know what this film was about, like, at all. I don't know that it had an impact.
Well, it actually has had a pretty significant impact, as a matter of fact. I mean, aside from the fact that it was successful in the box office, not crazy successful, but it cost $50 to $54 million to create, and it ended up grossing $134 million. So by any measure, it was a success, not like a flaming brilliant success, but it was successful. The thing that it is interesting about it is the film that is credited with popularizing the use of the Guy Fawkes masks by anti-establishment political groups. So this is the idea that you see, for example, with the what's the group that does all the psychological or cyber warfare attacks? I can't think of them right now, but they use the Guy Fawkes mask. There's other examples where the Guy Fawkes masks are used in anti-establishment type activities, and so this has become almost like the front and center image of that by showing it in a new light. And in some ways, my understanding of the 5th of November is not that it would be an anti-establishment day, but it was actually a day of celebration because the people who tried to destroy the government were stopped. Right, Guy Fawkes was stopped back in the 1600s from killing the King of England, and everyone was like, "Yay, let's celebrate that for decades to come." And then this film and this idea that was presented in the DC comic series that this was based off of actually took that in some ways, turned it on its head, and said, "This is a day to celebrate being anti-government in some ways," or that's what it was attempting to do. So it's interesting in that regards as well. The only other thing that I think is interesting in regards to a final note on this is that the actual creator of the comics, Alan Moore, was not credited in this film, and he actually asked not to be credited in this film. He had two other pieces of his comic works that had been adapted in the past, including From Hell and the League of Incredible Gentlemen, and he was so disappointed with those adaptations of his works that he said, "Please do not put me as credited on this work," and he refused to end up watching it anyways. So I don't know if that speaks to the film itself. It's just interesting that even the creator of the work was not expecting much from this film. It had an impact in spite of his thoughts, but is that the goal he was looking for? I don't really know. I don't know enough about the original comics to have an opinion on that. But that's what we got for V from Vendetta, and I think that's honestly probably a good place to end it. So that's the pod. We hope you all enjoyed. We'll be back as we always are next week. We'll see you all then.